Okay, great.
So I didn't, talk with her in Zoom.
Yeah.
She just seemed like
Nice.
a good person.
Good.
That I-
Good, good. Nice.
With the history department, religious studies departments, as well as being a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences Data Scholarship Program. She focuses on early Christian studies, girls and women in early Egyptian monasticism, and she co-leads a digital humanities project called the Coptic Scriptorium, together with Amir Zeldes at Georgetown University. And I browsed through this. It was so interesting. You can find Coptic texts, translations, there's a dictionary. You can analyze and annotate Coptic texts. And it's actually a very beautiful website as well. So I really enjoyed that. So I encourage everyone to look at that. Her most recent book is entitled Children and Family in Late Antique Egyptian Monasticism, that was published by Cambridge University Press. And tonight her talk will be on monks and their children. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, there's one more person to admit. Oh, did you get it?
I got it.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk tonight. I really appreciate it. So today we are going to go in a little different direction than maybe some of the other talks, because we're going to go to Egypt. So I will be talking to you about Egypt. And there we go. So Egypt is one of the earliest places for Christian monasticism. And as Bill and I were talking earlier, before we started, many of the rules from one early monastery in Egypt were translated into Latin and became foundational for the rule of the master and the Benedictine rule in Western medieval monasticism. So Egypt is very important for the whole history of Christian monasticism. And we'll be looking at several monasteries, primarily from the 330s, 350s to say 600. Probably today, most of the material I'll be talking about cuts off at about 500. So very early medieval, pre-medieval, late antique Egypt, and children and monasteries. So I'll talk today about children and the origins of monasticism, education and care of children in monasteries, health and labor of children in monasteries, and the conception of monasteries as families. And most of this material is taken from my book that we already heard about. So check it out. Thanks. So I just want to give a little heads up that there will be some discussion or mention of violence and abuse that is unfortunately part of the ancient world, and also unfortunately parts of monasteries. And I would say these are things that are quite common in the late antiquity, early medieval period. But the people who experienced these things also protested them. So although these things were unfortunately common, they were not necessarily accepted or approved of by everybody. So there was, I would not say, we should just sort of dismiss them as of the time, because there were people who experienced them who, protested that experience. Okay, so first, children and the origins of monasticism. So one of the things when I was first starting this book was people would ask us, the early monks in Egypt, the Desert Fathers, there were no children in those monasteries. They were ideal monks, right? They were like the first monks. They were getting away from all of that. And in fact, there were children. But you were right to kind of question, were there children? And if there were, how did they get there? Because there is a real rhetoric in the earliest sources about monasteries that monks and monasticism is a retreat or a renunciation from family. And in our first Christian saint's life of Antony, really emphasizes this. So Antony was, you know, an early monk, one of the first, and he tried to be a solitary. People kept flocking to him, and he kept going deeper in the desert, right? So there is still a monastery in Egypt on the site of where he was, and where he lived. We're not sure if the cave up there is exactly his cave, but he probably lived in that area in the desert in Egypt. And in the 300s, thousands of people, both in Egypt and people coming from abroad, from Europe, from Palestine, flocked to the desert of Egypt to become monks and to learn from monks like Antony, who were there and who lived in the desert in Egypt. And in his saint's life, monasticism is described as a retreat from family and city, and also pleasure. And the author of the Life of Antony writes about Antony's popularity. And so from then on, there were monasteries in the mountains, and the desert was made a city by monks who left their own people and registered themselves for the citizenship in the heavens. So this idea that the desert becomes a city of monks, I use this picture to kind of help portray it, because you can see on the top these mounds in the desert, and under those mounds are monastic settlements, right, that have not been excavated yet. Probably by now they've either been excavated or looted. This is an old picture. But then on the bottom, you'll see the, little monastic settlements. There would be, maybe 2 or 3 monks in each of those little squares living, with a kitchen and their rooms and praying. So the desert is city, you kind of can understand that now from seeing that image, I hope. So one of the things I'm going to argue is that even though early Christian monks renounced sex and family in order to become monks, right? Monks take a vow of celibacy. The monasteries that were developing in Egypt did raise children and educated them. And in fact, at this time, expected them to carry on their monastic lineage and become monks as adults. And some of the early monastic writers saw children as kind of the future of their monasteries. Now, this is not always the case in monasticism. Some monasteries take children in and then they leave when they become adults for various reasons. But there is evidence in Egypt, at least in the late 300s, 400s, that some of the monastic leaders expected them to stay and become monks. But it was not, always an easy situation for the children in the monasteries. So as I'm going to describe, children live on a crossroads. In some ways, by living in a monastery, they were protected from the harsh realities of a pretty poverty-stricken, most people in late antiquity, the early medieval period, are poor. And so they're guaranteed, housing, healthcare, food, and probably some education. But in other ways, they were still vulnerable to the whims and desires and ambitions of the adult monks around them. And so, they were not always treated well by the adult monks. And the adult monks also fully embraced the late antique, early medieval social and familial hierarchies, right, where fathers are on the top, and children are above enslaved people, but on the bottom otherwise. So there's a bit of a paradox there, which we'll explore today. So in terms of the rhetoric about renunciation of family and, this sense that surely these early monasteries didn't have children in them, there is very powerful rhetoric in some of our early sources against children. So the sayings of the Desert Fathers are these little pithy little anecdotes and sayings by early monks and many of them are monks from Egypt. We should not take them as historical fact, but we should take them as wisdom that later monks thought should be passed on, right? So some of these sayings were very anti-child. So one of the more famous ones from Abba Isaac, do not bring young boys here, for congregations in Scetus are deserted because of boys. And then a saying from Abba Macarius, who's a very famous Egyptian monk, when you see a cell built close to the marsh, know that the devastation of Scetus is near. When you see trees, know that it is at the doors. And when you see young children, take up your sheepskins and go away. Right. So, and Scetus is a monastic settlement with several monasteries, plus sort of more looser communities of monks between kind of Alexandria and Cairo. Right. So, this is not very pro-child, especially in communities of monks. You get the sense here that children may be dangerous even, right? And there's not an explanation of why children are dangerous. And people often point to, well, is there something maybe concerning sexual temptation, especially for adolescent boys who might be around the monastery? Or also we see in some other sayings of the Desert Fathers, references to the labor that's required to raise children and a family. And so having children around may also just be distracting from your monastic practice, right? And your prayer and your devotion, because somebody has to take care of the children. So today, I'm going to talk about a few different monasteries. That's Scetus up at the top. A lot of my sources are from this federation of monasteries called the White Monastery Federation, or the Federation of Shunuta, which is a group of 3 monasteries. And the reason why a lot of my material is from there is because it's really our largest corpus of material from an early monastery that's contemporaneous. So like not saints' lives, but actual letters, sermons, and rules. We have volumes and volumes of material from Shunuta and his successors. So that monastery actually has 3 monasteries in what's called a federation. The White Monastery was a monastery for men. It's called the White Monastery because the church building that you see there is made from white stone. And that's actually the church. It's a big basilica. The rest of the monastery would have been around it. And it's, now it's just kind of excavated ruins, plus some modern buildings. And then the Red Monastery was just north of the White Monastery. And it's called the Red Monastery because the stone for that basilica is red, so a reddish. And then that was also a community of men. And that is a remarkable space because the church building, the sanctuary for it, still has wall paintings from like the 5th century through to the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And they were just restored a few years ago. And it's not the easiest place to get to, but it's gorgeous. If you can go, it's really remarkable, as you can see from that picture. And then there was a women's monastery in this federation as well that was built on the ruins of a pagan temple, and a temple to an Egyptian goddess named Repis, who was like a panther, tiger, lioness type goddess. And so the women's community was there in this sort of village on the remains of this temple. The other 2 monasteries that I draw material from for today, the monastery of Pachomius. If you've heard of any sort of communal monasteries from Egypt, you probably heard of Pachomius. He founded a number of monasteries for men and for women, and a big federation. And then there's a monastery called the Monastery of Nakloon that's further north that probably you've never heard of because it's not very famous, but it is a monastery with rules nonetheless. And these are all communities from which we have rules that survive and rules that can tell us a little bit about children, right? Because they mention children in the rules and how to treat children. Okay, so education and care of children. Just gonna get a sip of water here real quick. Okay, so first, I want to say something about children and the monastic hierarchy and kind of the language that's used in these sources. So in these monasteries, the language of age or kind of family relationship is also the language of monastic rank, right? So the father of the monastery and the father of the whole federation, if it's a federation, is the top guy, right? He's the leader. And then you'll have elders that would be called old man or old women. You could be 30 years old and be considered an old man or old woman if you're a really good monk. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're old. It just means you're an established monk. And likewise, great men and great women are, established monks. And then parents, fathers and mothers are often other like house leaders and kind of, leaders of smaller groups in the community, or you would even call people who are senior to you fathers and mothers. And then there are children, both boys and girls, that are referenced in the sources. Now, the thing about the word for boy is it just is in Coptic at least, it's the word for like little son. And likewise, a girl is a little daughter. So one of the challenges is, do we know when you talk about little sons and little daughters, are we talking about minor children or new monks, like novices, right? This is a major challenge in the Coptic. So Coptic is the language of Egypt in the Roman period and until Arabic takes over. So in the Coptic sources, this is a challenge. The Greek sources, there are other challenges with the Greek language, but most of the material I was looking at is in Coptic. So it can be a challenge, but we can know from context that there are minors. So we'll have rules that say blah, blah, blah until they come of age, right? Or they might reference beardless, they're beardless boys. And so then, okay, they're younger, they're not adults who are just novices. But it can be a challenge. And so in some of these communities, it really does seem like children refers to both minor children and also new monks. And so that is a challenge. It's a collective group. Okay, so another question everybody asks me is, how do children get to the monastery? Like, how do they get there? And this is the hardest question to ask, to answer from our sources. So folks who know medieval monasticism better than I do in Europe, I know that at least at some monasteries, there are at least some accounts of who is in there or when they came or how they got there, or maybe their parents, or if they're, high ranking families, you might know that. We don't have any of those kinds of records from 4th and 5th century Egypt. So we just have references to children and families. So we have references to like women who complain about not being able to see their sons and husbands over in the men's monastery. So we know that there were families that came together, or a family that was all expelled together because the father broke the rules and then they kicked out the whole family. So there are families joining together, presumably because of poverty, right? Presumably some kind of economic circumstance. And then there is some evidence for orphans that are there, or abandoned children. But that's a little less obvious.
The fire station is next to us.
Oh, okay, good. So we don't have to leave. Okay, great. The saints' lives talk about runaways. And so that's a possibility also, that there are some children who have run away and joined monasteries. And then we know there are some girls whose families have sent them to the women's monastery from the letters that talk about them. There's one girl in particular who writes to her family and complains about, or a young woman, and she complains about how she's being treated in the monastery, and her father is very high up in the nearby town. And so that causes a bit of a stir. But so we know that, the family from that letter, we know, okay, there are families who send their daughters even at this early period. Most people, though, are joining monasteries at this time period as adults. And nonetheless, it's thought that when people join monasteries as children, they would make better monks because they would be taught at an early age how to be a good monk. So in the life of Pachomius, Pachomius is said to have said that it is easier for children to reach this degree, that being obedient from their earliest age, they may eagerly strain ahead to the things that are before until they reach perfection. For ground that has been cleared is ready to be planted, right? So this idea that they join the monastery, they will, you know, at an early age, you know, they will learn better. We also have another fragment of another version of the life of Pachomius, where Pachomius says, set a little one, where Pachomius set a little one in the midst of his disciples and said, you know, quoting the Bible, right? Anyone who shall receive a young child such as this in my name receives me. But as for other little ones who have acquired an evil bent in their youth, and then of course, just as it gets good, the manuscript breaks off, right? Like it's damaged. As Solomon says, anyone who lives wantonly from his youth shall become a slave. And so, my brothers, every young child, as well as those who are older, whom the Lord has brought to us for the rebirth, let us be zealous many times, let us teach them. So there's a kind of philosophy of teaching and caring for children that goes hand in hand with this view about, you know, children's upbringing and what the monastery is supposed to do for children that are brought to them. So for children, they require dedicated teachers and caregivers. Not everyone is good enough to be able to raise children in a monastery. So in the letters and rules from Shnuta, he says, for some people who have children who were entrusted to their care, if it is of no concern to them that they live self-indulgently, joking with the children and sporting with them, they will be removed from this task, for they are not fit to be entrusted with children. It is in this way also with women who have girls given to them. And so that word for children is really boys, but I kind of translated it gender neutral. And then he also says, if they're children who have grown up and they have reached the age of majority, so here we know, okay, so we got minor children here we're talking about, then it will be done to them as it is written for us. So like they're in the monastery, and once they hit the age of majority, they have to follow our rules, right? You know, they got some time to learn how it works. And then when they become adults, you know, all the consequences for the rules go to them as well as for us as adults. If they are disobedient and they do not learn to be wise, they shall be cast out from us. So the thought is they're going to grow up to become monks and they have to follow the rules just like everybody else when they become an adult. Shnuta also says about people who are responsible for children, the measure of children is a parent. Those who will cause them to sin in these places every time, they will be cast out. So if you are contributing to the delinquency of a minor, you will be expelled from the monastery. Now, we do not know exactly what the education was for children in monasteries. We know more about education in the cities. So in the city, especially in the major cities along the Nile, there was Greek education even. So there were Greek schools. We do know a little bit about education generally in monasteries. So in the Pachomian monasteries, literacy, you know, everybody was supposed to be taught to be literate. And so if they don't know how to read, when they enter the monastery, even as adults, they're taught to read. So the assumption is that children then would also have been taught to read. If it's a requirement for adults, surely children would have been taught, although we don't have any direct evidence. So in some of the rules attributed to Pachomius, we see it's a very traditional educational system. The fundamentals of a syllable, the verbs and nouns shall be written for him. And even if he does not want to, he shall be compelled to read. So if they don't want to learn to read, you got to learn to read. There shall be no one whatever in the monastery who does not learn to read and does not memorize something of the scriptures. And we have a lot of these little ostraca, the school texts and syllabaries and alphabets from other monasteries further south, these little potsherds with things like that. Now, in Schroeder's monastery, we also don't have clear evidence of, what they're teaching the children other than the monastic way of life. But there was a major culture of reading and book production there. So again, you got to assume that they would be teaching the children to read. This monastery was the center for distributing things. So the Bishop of Alexandria would write to Schroeder and say, distribute this letter, in all your region. And there's a massive Coptic library that survived, fragmented, damaged, but survived at this monastery. So we know there's a big book production that was going on there. And even in the women's community, there's evidence that there were women who could read and write. So for example, that young woman who I mentioned earlier, she wrote to her family. Somehow she got some letter out to her family. And there also are there's some graffiti in the remains of the women's monastery. Now it's probably from a little later, like the 600s, but there's writing in there. They mention Schroeder from 200 years earlier, and they mention their own names and prayers. And so this is one that's very damaged, but it says little Evangelia sent out the water from the table of Zion along with the small girl, the Agnoste, and blah, blah, blah of the house of, stuff that we can't read. So we know there were, the men were not allowed in there. The only time men could go in there was if, the leader of the men of the whole federation or his kind of second in command came over with some people, or people were sent to bring supplies or something like that. So it's really likely these are the women in the monastery who are writing this. So there's some evidence that, there were girls and women who could read and write as well, although we don't know if they were taught. Okay. So in terms of discipline, we don't know a lot about discipline in any of the other monasteries except for Schroeder's. And he talks about corporal punishment of children as well as adults. And of course, in this time period, corporal punishment of children was very common. And corporal punishment of adults who disobeyed was very common. In schools, tutors and teachers could beat children in schools as well. And at Schroeder's monastery, children were kind of an exception in that they were allowed to be beaten by their superiors if they did something wrong without permission from higher up. But for adults, only the leader, the top father of the monastery could give that instruction. But for children, the people in charge were given more leeway to decide whether or not children needed corporal punishment. And that includes the girls as well. So, whether old or young, including, anyone who will deal one in our domain, the men's domain, or your domain, the women's domain, a blow with a rod or a slap, with the exception of boys and girls. Like, so the children, you can do that too, but you cannot decide on corporal punishment for the adults. And we know, if you really want to know more about that, I can say more about that, but we'll move on from that. There also were rules prohibiting sexual contact between children and between adults and children. And so there are rules like this at the Nakloon Monastery as well, but the ones from Schroeder's Monastery are more detailed. We have just more stuff survived. So kissing and also anything that could lead to sexual temptation. So like removing a thorn from your foot, you're like, what is going on with that? But of course it involves touching and lifting. So you would see up somebody's monastic robes, right? Or their tunic or like whatever they're wearing. So washing, like anything that could possibly be considered sexual temptation, there were rules about that, and rules specifically identifying children as, potential, victims of this kind of thing. So this is an example of children, right, being, more protected and like concerned that you want to protect the children. Whereas we have other examples, right, of children, well, think it's appropriate, you could beat them. So that's an example of the kind of paradox and, the complications that I mentioned before. Okay, health and labor. We know a little bit about what children did and ate. Well, I don't know so much about their diet, but we know about the frequency of their diet. So in Schroeder's monastery, children were allowed to have 2 meals a day, whereas adults normally just had 1 meal and bread. And in the Pacomian Federation, we're told that children are given extra food and just sort of generically extra food and bread. Whereas, the monks are supposed to be the adults are practicing a more austere practice. And I haven't talked a lot about the images, but these pictures are from the excavation of the women's monastery at Schroeder's Federation. And those are stone benches. And so there would have been a round wooden table in the middle. This is their refectory where the women would have eaten. So you can see them all kind of lined up. There would have been these, benches, stone benches with the wooden table that they ate around. And you can see like that on the top of that, the one on the left, there are like little legs under there. Those are the stones from the temple, right? That's the pharaonic, right? It's actually from the Ptolemaic period. So, but they're all still using the same kind of decoration. They look, the art is still the same. So yeah. In the life of Pachomius, we have an account of children needing more food. And the story is Pachomius goes to this one monastery. He hasn't been there for a while. And this boy comes up to him and says, hey, we haven't been fed cooked food since you last visited. And he takes the monks there to task. And, he asks the people who are cooking, why have you not fed these children cooked food? What's going on? And they said, well, we've all been fasting. And so we don't want to make food that we're just going to throw out or like whatever. And the Pachomius is like, no, you've got to take care of the children. You need to, you need to make cooked food for them. And also you need something to renounce. Like, what good is your fasting if you don't have the food around to say no to, right? So there are 2 reasons why they should be cooking food. One is for the children. So in terms of labor, again, we know more about children at Schroeder's community, and boys would distribute weaving materials. So weaving mats was a common monastic labor practice, and they would sell the mats, for money for the monastery. So boys could distribute the weaving materials, but they had to be supervised, and girls in their community would light lamps for the women monks gatherings, but again, only when supervised. And girls also distributed the wool for the women's textile work. So the women were weaving fabric and textiles. And the men were weaving mats. They were doing other things too, but these are the 2 references to children. And adolescents were exempt from harvesting dates. So there's this interesting rule that appears twice, and it's because the date leaves and the date palms are so sharp that they can get cut. So they are not allowed to harvest dates. And the supervisors of children are taken to task for kind of sitting back and like, chastising the children and making the children do their work for them. So any adults that try to make the children do their work for them are in big trouble. So considered lazy. And these are actually like grain, like mills where you would like grind the grain. Yeah. So children who were sick, would, along with adults who were sick also, could receive extra wine. But, you know, she was very clear, only if you're really, really sick, right? So you get the sense that there are people who are kind of faking being sick so they can get extra food and wine. Also, there are these, you know, regular, you know, gatherings for prayer where everybody's supposed to gather in the church, right, for prayer. And sick children, you can either carry them to the prayer assembly or they're allowed to stay in their houses if they need to stay in their houses. There is some kind of infirmary at these bigger monasteries. So we know, from the rules and references as well. There's a specific place also where people who are really sick who need that kind of care can go. But I guess people who are a little sick can just stay in their house. So in terms of like what we know about children's life in monasteries, they seem at this period in Egypt to be a small population, but well integrated. There are lots of rules for them. They have roles, and they're seen as requiring special consideration. They're an obstacle for adults and, you know, potential master ascetics, and they're not really full monks yet, but they're also not laity because they're expected to become monks. And they're cherished, but also vulnerable to abuse. So a lot of the things that I mentioned have mentioned that. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is how monasteries themselves are kind of conceived of as families. And you saw that a little bit with references to the, you know, the language of rank, right? And there's fathers and mothers, and they would call each other siblings. You know, your brothers and sisters are your fellow monks. But there's even more very explicit language about monks being families. So this is a long quote, sorry. So this is Schroeder talking about monastic families, but you can see this in lots of other monastic writings. And so he talks about people who have not had children according to the flesh, or who renounced their children, right? Adults who maybe became monks after they had children, along with their numerous material possessions, because they wish to follow according to the worth of the calling which called them to this life. He's very verbose, I'm sorry. They are eunuchs and virgins. They renounced legitimate marriage and the chaste bed, along with sons, daughters, siblings, parents, and everything they had, you know, very similar to what we saw with the life of Antony, right? Remembering the word of the Lord, the one who follows me must hate his father and his mother, his son, his brothers and sisters, and even his own soul. That even his own soul part, I think, is a little interpolation. These people are the eunuchs who do not have children according to the flesh, but instead are fathers to many children of God, since they do not have children or renounced all those they did have, along with all their material possessions. They took their cross and followed the Lord. And such are our holy ancestors, the prophets and the apostles, who truly were eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. Right? And that's directly from the Gospels. Jesus says, make yourselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. As a result, they were fathers to many people, just as the Lord said. Everyone who leaves his household, his brother or sister, father or mother, wife or son or daughter, or his community, for my name, he will receive them back manifold and will inherit eternal life. Right? So you're making a new family with new brothers and sisters and children and fathers and mothers in the monastery. And he packs about every possible biblical quote you can pack in there to prove his point. So it's this new family created by people who have renounced their families of origin or family through marriage and sexual reproduction. And I just wanted to show, so this is the Red Monastery, and it's visible to a certain extent in the art, in that the fathers of the monastery are kind of like this genealogy that have been painted into the art. So this is the sanctuary is like a clover leaf where you have like a half dome on the left, one in the center, one on the right. And so on the left is that picture of the nursing, the painting of the nursing virgin that I showed at the beginning. In the middle, like right, directly the direction you're praying is like the second coming of Jesus. And then on the right is Jesus as the Word, Christ is the Word, he's holding the Gospels. And then the four authors of the Gospels are around him. And they're a little, the one in the middle is a little difficult because there are layers of paintings on top of paintings. There's underneath it is actually, the older one is is it Ezekiel's chariot? Anyway, so this one is the second coming. Anyway, so underneath the nursing virgin, where she's, Mary nursing the baby Jesus, are four of the early fathers of the monastery. And the first founder of the Red Monastery is painted first on the right hand of that second coming of Jesus. So on the left, to us, on the left of that center, but to Jesus, it would be on his right hand, right? You'll see, you can't see it super well, but there are four leaders, one right after the other, that are all kind of this like little genealogy of the monastic fathers painted right under the nursing virgin in that semi-dome, starting with the founder. So yeah, that's a better one. So despite strong impairment, so you got like the Holy Family, right? The Holy Family, and then the fathers of the monastery. So you've got your little monastic genealogy there. Despite strong imperatives to renounce minor children, the sources do testify to the significance of children in these very early monasteries. And although comprised of people who had renounced sex and family, they were institutions with intergenerational continuity through the raising of children. Now that is sort of the end, but I have a little postscript because I suspect some of you are wondering about the nursing virgin. So because people have not been to Egypt and looked at Christian art in Egypt are like, why is there this picture of the Virgin with her breast exposed in a monastery, in a men's monastery? There are actually like 4 or 5 of these that we have survived. There's that one in the Red Monastery. This one is in a monastery up near Sketis, the one on the right, and they're very similar. It's the same kind of iconography that you see in Egypt of the goddess Isis nursing Horus, her son, who's the new king. The god that sort of represents the living king of Egypt, the gods of Egypt. And it's not sexual. So what's happening here is the monks are venerating the Virgin whose milk is sustaining God himself, right? So there's the baby Jesus and her milk is sustaining God himself. And, that is what they're venerating. And almost like they, monks are supposed to be kind of imitating Jesus. And so it's like they wish they could be drinking also of that milk, but not in a sexual way, in a like that spiritual nourishment. This appears in several monasteries as this kind of spiritual nourishment. And yes, so thank you. Yeah.
Tables or the benches where. a
Yeah.
table would be moved,
Yeah.
All set against a wall and like.
I don't know. So that space has not been fully excavated, but it looks like it was a narrow room.
Yeah.
And then so you would like come in along the side and then the wall, the tables were against a wall, and it may just be, yeah, because it was built, it was reuse of space, right? That whole community was a reuse of space in a temple. So, it's still being excavated. So I don't know, we don't know the full layout yet, but yeah.
So there was nothing like on display on the walls while they're in there.
I mean, what you saw is, as far as I know, what there was. Now, there is always this complication in Egypt where excavations kind of throw everything out till you get to the Pharaonic, right? And so all those layers of like the medieval Muslim and Arabic and Coptic, right? Like there's been a tradition of that. And so I will be honest, I don't 100% know about that wall that's behind them, if there was anything else on top of it. But as far as I know, there wasn't. They just were reusing that for, and what was back there was, you know, a procession for the goddess Repet. And, you know, yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, I'll just ask you one thing. In terms of the nursing virgin, you find that in Renaissance Italy and, in the Renaissance a lot, there's a discussion of that. In Dutch Baroque, there's a discussion of that as well, like the Virgin is a life giving.
Yes.
But I've never thought about the origins of the nursing virgin. Does it come from Egypt? Is that the origins of it? Because those are some of the earliest examples.
So I'm not an art historian. And so I don't know if it appears anywhere else, but they're the earliest ones I know of. Well, the Syrian one is earlier than the one in the Red Monastery. The Syrian one is like 6th century. And you know, the Isis and Horus is of course much older. So yeah.
Professor?
Okay, I'm gonna take a question, 2 questions in the room, and then I'll come to you, okay?
Okay.
Awesome, thank you. Let me pull that up. You can see the raised hands. Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah, Joyce.
I'm curious, so there were the Egyptian sculptures still in place, or not sculptures, but in their so there are these Christian monks with these Egyptian pagan.
Yes.
And the monks did not
The
destroy
reliefs.
them?
So, this is a very good question. They're in some of these stones are in the other the white and the red monasteries too, although they're less visible. They reused other stones from the Temple of Repet for those churches as well. Monks did destroy existing pagan temples that were being used as pagan temples, or even there's a very famous story about Schroeder himself going into a man's house and destroying his shrine to the pagan gods in his house. And of course he gets into trouble for that. So yes, and yeah, I mean, they did destroy, but they reused also.
What you showed on that.
I know. Yeah, they would have been right there. Yes, yeah. Yes, and those.
I mean, they didn't like Jews, so you think they'd even less like.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, for that particular room, I don't know if they had plastered anything over and we just don't have it anymore. I don't know. Yeah, I just don't know. Okay, we'll take your question and then we'll go to the Zoom people. Yeah,
Thank you for your fascinating presentation.
thank you.
All a reference the period of religious fervor, where convinced that monastic is the wise virgin, whole families, the man and the son were living in the monastery, and then the daughter was from.
Yeah,
I took that as pious exaggeration. I'm starting to think that perhaps even in the Greek world, there is a tradition of actually children in these monasteries.
Yeah.
So my real question, there's a fascinating corollary with the Shakers, who were celibate, but who became orphanages for the state and sin children.
Yeah.
Who became their major source of recruitment.
Interesting.
So, and when they state quit doing that, they started to die out. I'm wondering if you have an idea of how important were these children who stayed responsible for the vitality of
Yeah.
the
This is so this question, I don't know if the Zoom people heard it, like how important are the children to the vitality and the like longevity of these monasteries? I mean, because we don't really know, it's very hard to answer that question because we just don't know how many are joining and under what circumstances they are all joining. Certainly, this example of this woman, which, I keep coming back to because it's like one of the few examples we have of like a real person with connections outside. That's not a saint's life. It's actually a letter from the time period. That certainly they did not want to upset her family. There you can tell in the letter that, her family probably gave money, So, there's some evidence that yes, they were important, and not just for bodies, but also for donations. But to what extent, I don't know. I just can't answer because we just don't have numbers. We don't, it's hard to say. I'm sorry. I wish I could answer the question better.
No, I mean, that's always a steady stream of displaced versus grants.
Yeah, yeah.
And in Egypt, just a different subject.
Yeah, it is. And there's this in Egypt, adoption of family members is much more common. And so, cousins will be adopted and, so, there's a really like long-standing tradition of families, taking in people who, are the more distant relatives and then becoming part of the family. And it gets confusing when they're all called brothers and sisters and those sources as well. And so it is also, it is a different, it is a different social network system, but there are people who are joining for religious reasons, obviously, but there are, of course, people who are joining for economic reasons. So, yeah. Okay, well, 1 minute and then we'll go to the Zoom people. So was it Rylan?
Yes, it is.
Hi,
Hi.
Rylan.
Hi. So my question has to do with iconography. So, in my early church history class from my previous university, we discussed how pagan art and belief was kind of converted or melded into Christian iconography. So do you think that the images of Isis and Horus could have been inspired or adapted the iconography of Mary feeding Jesus?
Okay, so the question is, did Christians kind of adapt or were inspired by these little especially their little statuettes of Isis nursing Horus? And there's real debate about that. So the latest line from art historians is that perhaps they weren't kind of copying Isis and Horus, but it's kind of part of the same, they're just all coming from the same milieu because these statuettes start appearing more in the Greek period than anything else. And so maybe it's all kind of it's all coming from the same cultural stew. So it's debated. So it's a good question.
Okay.
Were there any other questions on Zoom?
Well, I mean, something else, I'm sorry, this is
Go for
Rylan again. Is Isis feeding Horus is typically a symbol of like rebirth or revitalization,
Yes.
from what I remember. So I don't know, it's just a thought.
Yeah, so the point is that Isis, if you couldn't hear, Isis feeding Horus is a symbol of rebirth. And also, I mean, she's a queen and he's, he's the god who is the god of represents the living king. And that also is very, amenable to Christian interpretation with Jesus as, the king of heaven and all that. So, yeah. And, resurrection and rebirth. So, yes. Great. And you had a question? Yeah.
Is there any evidence or suggestion that she's been sent there in order to keep her from complaining to the family so much?
Oh, that's a good question. So the letter, it's Shenouda's successor. His name is Beza, and I mean, he's writing it to try to, knock her down a peg, right? So that she doesn't leave the monastery. Because she's apparently written to her parents and saying that she's been abused in the monastery. She's been mistreated, like, beaten or punished inappropriately. And and so Besa basically writes to her and says, no, you're the one who's been acting inappropriately and you deserve everything you got. And if you leave, we are gonna tell everybody else that you have been behaving inappropriately and nobody's gonna want you at any other monastery. So we don't have any sense of what her parents think and what her family thinks. We just have kind of what he says that she's done and said, and he's kind of twisting it to make it sound like she's really in the wrong. But from everything you know about the monastery, I mean, she probably was beaten and, she probably didn't like it. And, and is complaining about that. And her parents did send her like a care package. So they sent her some stuff and she gave like some perfume to a friend. And I don't know how she got that in there because they're not supposed to be getting these special gifts. But apparently the mother of because the women's monastery, you should imagine, is kind of mostly running on their own with these, occasional letters and visits from the father of the whole federation. So, she's got a lot of power and you kind of wonder, did she let like this woman get this care about, like what is going on over there? But yeah, so we don't know what the family thought. And she's the daughter of like a duke. Yeah. And so, just like in the medieval period, you imagine, there's an extra daughter maybe or something that, they're not going to marry off and they give her to the monastery and they give the monastery money. And yeah.
Someone in the church who can pray for the family.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
West, all the three fourths, those women back, servants.
Yeah.
He's not restricting those who don't.
Right. And so that's a really interesting point because, it's thought that the women's communities of like the Pacomian monasteries and then Shnuda's monastery, that they were very, very tight and that there's not visitors, they're not leaving. But also this particular women's community is in a village and like, I don't know how inhabited the village is. And sometimes the women yell to complain, like they complain and, the father writes the letter saying, stop yelling along the walls. And so then you wonder, can people outside hear? So I do wonder if they're a little more porous than we like to think, because the men's communities, like people are visiting all the time. People are visiting the white like that big white basilica. They're visiting there all the time. And there are, military leaders and there are local officials and, people from the town that go there to hear the father preach. I mean, there are people visiting there all the time. And there are more rules about the women's monastery, but you do kind of wonder if it was more porous than the rules make it sound like it is. So.
Source of refuge.
Yeah.
You could go there for a while when you were in trouble.
Yeah.
Your family was in trouble. Then you could calm down and you could leave.
Yeah. Yeah, Joyce.
What we saw, those pictures of the monasteries, it looked very austere and dry and like, where do they get food, where do they get anything? But you're saying there was actual population around there?
So let me see. I gotta get rid of this here. Let me go back. Yes, that's where I'm going. I'm going to that picture. It's not, I kind of cropped the picture, but yeah. So, right. So yeah, there's cultivated ground today. It might not have come that far up back then, but you know, the Nile is not that far. Like if I hadn't cropped it, you could see the big city and the Nile and then the big city on the other side of the Nile. So it's not that far. And of course the Nile would flood and then, you know, irrigate the land, and they would farm. They had farming there. So, and now there's like people living all around the Red Monastery. So it's dry. I mean, those desert cliffs, it is very dry, but the Nile is not too far. And, you know, the cities along the Nile is not too far. This is not deep in the desert. It's just, you know, a little way out from the cultivated areas.
Monasteries or did the monasteries grow their own food somehow?
So they grew some of their own food. They did go, some of the rules talk about like, okay, you know, like 3 people need to, when you go out to go trading or selling or buying things, you know, it should be 3 people who go out to do that. And 1 needs to be pretty mature monk. So there was buying and selling, as well as growing some of their own.
Did they own the land or the Western Monastery?
Yes. Now,
So they-
the Pachomian monastery, the original monastery the Pachomius founded, the first one was on his family's estate.
West became great.
Yeah. Yes. And this happens. And then like into the 7th century, there are some big monastic estates and then they shrink. Yeah. Yeah. And they pay taxes to like not like, it's not clear what's going on in like the late 300s and early 400s, but the later, like in the 600s, we have receipts and documents from some monasteries that were very active then about taxes and paying taxes. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I have, well, 2 short questions. One is, were there any unfree persons also in the monasteries? And the second one is the rules about not touching minors and so on. Is that to protect the minors or to protect the monks from sinning?
Yeah, so the second question first, I mean, really a lot of it is to protect the monks, I think, and to prevent, you know, so that they don't sin, because there's not, you know, a lot of these sources are just really from the adult perspective, the adult lens, and like what's going on with the adults. So, unfortunately, in terms of were there enslaved people in these monasteries? This is a really good question. There's not a lot of documentation. There is one monastery I didn't talk about down in Thebes, was modern Luxor. This monastery, I don't know if any of you know, there's this temple. It's very famous. It's got these like terraces and then columns, Hatshepsut's temple, right? There was a monastery there. That was one of the monasteries where they just like got rid of everything to like restore Hatshepsut's temple, right? And so the documentation is not great. But there are papyri there about children that were donated that seem to have been enslaved or servants of some kind because their labor, there's a discussion of the fruits of their labor belong to the monastery. And even if they leave the monastery, the fruits of their labor still belong to the monastery. So those children, and this is from the 600s, seem to be, if not enslaved, indentured, or something. And so they're, you know, and even into adulthood, so there would be adults there with that status. And to build these things like that basilica, I mean, the monks didn't build that, right? So there were hired laborers. We don't know, you know, there's not a discussion of enslaved people, but Augustine talks about, you know, in North Africa, there were enslaved women in that community, in the Cappadocian community, there were, you know, and some of the monasteries in Palestine, there were enslaved people where, especially the women's community, and there's discussion of everybody should be treated the same, but then you're thinking, are they really all being treated the same? So, yeah,
The idea.
yeah. So I wish I had a better answer. I mean, there also is in Egypt this tradition of like temple, enslaved temple servants, from the Pharaonic period and the Ptolemaic Greek periods. But there's not discussion of that in these sources, so sorry. Yeah, sure.
So these pictures of the Virgin Mary and whatever else is going on there, were those created contemporary with the building of the monastery, or are they from a later time?
So there's a series. So certainly the fathers are painted in like the 5th and 6th centuries, that lower register. I don't know precisely the date of the Virgin, but there's all these layers going from like the 5th and 6th centuries on up. So but the buildings were built in the 400s.
Where did these motifs and these designs and these artists all come from? Is that something?
That's a really good question. I mean, some of them are Egyptian, but one of the 12th century painter is named in the Red Monastery, and he is not from Egypt. I cannot remember where he's from. I'm sorry. But I say he's from what? I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't think he's from Constantinople. I wanted to say Palestine, but that would be odd. But I don't remember. I'm sorry. The 12th century art history part, don't keep in my head. Sorry. Yeah. But if you're really interested, I have a whole book about the paintings. At this monastery, there's another book about the paintings at St. Anthony's Monastery. And because there are also some phenomenal paintings in that church. So, I can send those names of those books to you. Okay. If you're interested.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.